Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us here at the Sandwich Public Library. My name is Matthew Jones, and I serve as the Adult Services Coordinator here at the library. And we just want to start by greeting you and thank you for sharing your time with us this evening. And we're so excited to share this webinar with you. This evening, we're going to be hearing from Laurent Pernot, who has written a book, There and Here, Small Illinois Towns with Big Names. And of course, as you know, one of those towns he happens to mention is our very own Sandwich. We even made the cover, believe it or not. We're excited to hear him share a little bit about this, and then he's going to open himself up to Q&A, and we're going to take your questions and hear what you would like to know more about. Thank you, Laurent, for being here tonight. And let me give just a few more instructions. And I see we have some more folks that are joining us. So in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, if you could drop in how many folks are watching with you tonight, that would be excellent. And then you should also see a Q&A feature. And that's where we'll, the feature that we'll use for the Q&A, of course. And so later on, that'll become very handy for you. If you're having trouble at all with the Q&A, feel free to drop your question in the chat box and we can see that there as well. So as long as everyone is able to find those features, that will be excellent when we come to the Q&A portion. And so we're going to begin by listening to Laurent. So Laurent, welcome. Thank you for coming to the library virtually and for sharing your time with us. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Hello, everybody. It's good to be here. Albeit virtually, you may recognize behind me the old Sandwich Library. So I'm not there in person, but I'm there in spirit. As I wrote in the book, Sandwich is one of the more charming, best historically preserved towns that I've seen. And I think all in all, I feature almost 150 towns in some way in the book, but obviously I went through dozens, if not hundreds more, and Sandwich really stood out. It also stood out for just how fun and quirky the early town history was. And we can maybe talk some more about this, but Matthew and I were talking before, this reference among several delicious stories about Sandwich of the first plat in town being recorded by someone named Beverage. These are things that I actually thought were made up when I first started the book, but there's certainly indications that they were indeed a lot of beverages, and one of them may have been John Beverage, the eventual governor of the state. And Matthew tells me the Beverage family is still very much present and active in town, which makes actually Sandwich fairly unique. A lot of towns were started by people who ended up speculating, cashed in and left. And so the fact that there's an enduring presence is a bit of a, if not anomaly, certainly makes Sandwich a little bit unique in the state. So again, I'm Laurent Pernot. I want to tell you a little bit about what started this book, and then tell you a little bit about some of the things that I discovered along the way, but mostly I want to make plenty of time for questions. I love doing these, so I told Matthew I could speak forever, so I'm going to try to make sure we get plenty of time. This is a great day for me. I got my first COVID vaccine shot earlier this afternoon, and I get to do this, which is one of my favorite things to do. That's my way of saying if I sound really, really goofy later, it's probably because the side effects are kicking in. A lot of people ask me where the book idea came from. And it's probably got kind of two sets of roots. The first one is I'm a foreign exchange student. Originally, I was from France, and still am from France. And I came to study at Elk Grove High School on Elk Grove Boulevard in Elk Grove Village, Illinois. And early on in the school year, I walk into one of my classes, and one of the assistant teachers says, "Oh, you know, you're French. I'm from Paris." So I start speaking French to her, and she looks at me, she starts laughing. She said, "No, Paris, Illinois." And I said, "Oh my God, there's a Paris, Illinois," which was which was a revelation. And then I did quite a bit of traveling throughout the state for my job, and saw a lot of these very alluring signs. And years and years into it, I said, it's time. I just got off the road and saw these. And what started as a kind of quirky discovery of what I thought would be some quirky places, not only revealed some fascinating histories and fascinating towns across the state. There's a tapestry that emerged of life and both its harshness and its beauty in the early hours of the state. I'm a traveler myself, but I have to say I did what many people did: head to Wisconsin, head to Michigan, hop on a plane at O'Hare, and there's the rather annoying joke, right, about the middle third of the country being flyover country. But many people in Illinois actually treat Illinois as their own flyover state, or at least their drive-through state. A lot of people don't actually know our state that well. I kind of found that out with my first book about the Cubs' history in Chicago. And many people don't understand fully where all the Cubs played and what they did. And I found very much the same dynamic here. We're obviously the land of Lincoln, and that has its own significance, obviously, for the history of the state, the history of the country. Every town in Illinois, by the way, has some Lincoln story. Some of them probably more believable than others, but everybody wanted to be associated with a great man in some way. But it also oversimplifies what the history of the state was early on. There was great bravery, and people were very inventive when they came and settled here. We forget just how harsh, desolate the wilderness could be. People would have to walk a week to get a plow sharpened. Those are things that we just sometimes forget. But also the concept of having had Lincoln here seems to have made us forget that our own history before Lincoln was not as neat and simple as we sometimes think it is. There was slavery in the state. There were lynchings deep into the 20th century in this state. And the slavery bit was very jarring to me, not only because there was slavery in Illinois, but because it was introduced by the French, which is certainly not something I learned in French school. This was a place that was so desolate that there were no institutions. We also forget that. The story of the American government and all its might empowering settlers across the country certainly is true, but there was a long lag between a settler arriving and any kind of infrastructure, right? So people had to be their own judges and juries. And that permeates several of the towns. Then the post office comes, and that's usually the seminal moment. Various farmsteads are fighting to be a post office. When you get to be a post office, you get a name, which is where a lot of these towns come from. And then the next big stage in development is the railroad. And if you get the railroad, you thrive. And if the railroad does not come, you don't thrive. That's how a lot of towns disappear. A lot of the settlers named the places after where they came from. It wasn't always obvious that there was a link to another country, because a lot of times where they came from was Kentucky. That's actually a lot of places in the middle third of the state, especially. A lot of people came from Kentucky. A lot of people in southern third of the state came from Tennessee. And so, Versailles and Paris are indeed named after the European countries, but indirectly, because they were really named after places in Kentucky, which themselves had been named for the places in France, for instance. A lot of the names come out of marketing ingenuity. Lima, Lincolnshire, Rome, those are all names just picked because they would sound good when you started selling plots in town. And it made for a fun story that stood out from the town next door. We often forget these towns started as businesses. They were just people who grabbed land and started offering plots because, they landed a store here or there. And so an alluring story got you more people to come and buy land. A lot of places were named from the Bible. Crete, Antioch, Zion, and a lot of the places in Little Egypt, which is how the southern part of the state is mentioned. But many of them did come from people just having melancholy for their own origins. Limerick, Glasgow, Frankfurt, Dundee. And then the last category of names are places like Cambridge, Metropolis, Tehran, Thebes, that really just come out of, these are wonderful places, and we hope to make our mark on this part of the world, and we aspire for these towns to become as great as those, and we are making a statement, and again, kind of going back to the idea of marketing. Going back to the idea of this part of the state being so overlooked sometimes, whether that's the north part, the southern part. The southern part of the state is one of the more fascinating parts of the country. We had the seat of a great pre-Columbian civilization that disappeared. And by the way, I think if you don't scratch beneath the surface, you assume that it was an example, as happened many times across the history of the country and Illinois, where white people came and eradicated the indigenous people who lived there, but really that civilization had largely collapsed of its own weight by the time white people arrived. But there was a lot of friction, obviously, a lot of violence on both sides, lots of violence. Early histories tend to focus on the violence from indigenous people onto the white settlers, and sometimes that not really focus on the fact that the white settlers not only broke the land, but took some of the funeral goods, for instance, and desecrated cemeteries and built their own homes on sacred burial grounds. And so there was a lot of friction, but just story after story of abnegation and courage on the part of the settlers. And then Southern Illinois continues to gain prominence under the French. It's the seat of Upper Louisiana, and then becomes the first capital of the state. And then the center of power starts moving towards Springfield over some decades, and eventually towards Chicago. There's other seats of powers that we don't really know about as much, if not for what was essentially a mini civil war between Mormon settlers and the state of Illinois, and some folks in places like Carthage and Warsaw, all of which are in the book. Salt Lake City might not exist today and might be located on the banks of the Mississippi in Western Illinois, because that's the capital of Nauvoo. And that was the great Mormon capital, and that's where the great Mormon temple was. And there's so many just wonderful discoveries, places you can only essentially get to via ferries. Places that, again, like Paris, that actually the name really doesn't have much to do with Paris, but embraced their heritage. Places like Glencoe, places like Pekin. All those are just manifestations of, I think, the great spirit of this state. Wonderful history that we often are not really aware of. And a lot of people make fun of the fact that a lot of these towns have names that are not pronounced anything like the other town. And the list is long of these. But I actually think that rather than a source of ridicule, it's really wonderful that we made it our own. We took, Cairo versus Cairo. I once asked for directions to Vienna, and people didn't know what I was talking about. And I spelled it, and they said, "Oh, you're looking for Vienna? Yeah, it's that way." And I actually think it's wonderful because we made it our own. These places are rooted in the old world, or they're rooted in mostly European culture, but we made it uniquely Illinois, and I think that's just wonderful. So a lot of human stories also emerge from the book. The fact that the Illinois was more home to coal than it was to corn for a long time. And, we could, if there is interest, we can talk a bit more about why that stopped. But most of these towns started because there was a coal vein. And the heartbreak of exploitation of the miners, the heartbreak of three brothers who came over from Italy, a lot of Belgian and a lot of Italian miners across the state. Three brothers come over from Italy to die in a mine together. They were each other's only family here. And there are stories like these all over the state. Tornadoes that destroy Shanghai City, but leave the tavern alone after the preacher the Sunday before had essentially said the Lord should blast the tavern to hell. There are just so many delicious stories, and I'll come back to Sandwich. So Sandwich did, there is a link to the idea of the Earl of Sandwich. And it's really through, John Wentworth, who was congressman and mayor of the city. He was the congressman for the Sandwich area. As was the case back in the day. There's no evidence he ever set foot in Sandwich. But the town needed a new name, didn't like the name of Newark. And as was the case across the state, many times people would want to name a town and realize someone else had already named it that, so you couldn't grab the name. So the town, the most likely story seems to be the town people wanted to ingratiate themselves with the congressman, so decided to pick the name of the town where his own family was from, and that's probably where we got the name. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we do have this wonderful juxtaposition of beverage and sandwich, which you just simply cannot make up, and it's just wonderful. So I hope that gives you a good sense of the book a little bit. I'd be happy to talk about specific towns or any other aspects of the state's history, which kind of permeates the book, if there's interest.
Thank you. That is fascinating. And you said before we started, you could start talking and keep talking for 3 days. And I think I'm almost ready to sign up for that. Like, I want to hear so much more. So those of you who are watching, feel free to begin dropping your questions in the Q&A, anything that you heard that you'd like to hear more about, or if there are specific towns that you'd like to hear him speak about, feel free to do that as well. So as you start formulating those questions and dropping them in there, I want to start by asking, how long of a project was this for you? I mean, because you said about 150. I think I lost count as I was trying to count how many towns there were. And you said there was some you visited. So talk to us about the process of writing this and photographing these places, and how long of a process was this for you?
Well, both my boss and my wife say I'm rather obsessive. I never knew it was going to turn into this. I thought this would turn into kind of a fun little web post about a few quirky names. And then I realized there were more and more of them that never heard of. And I assumed because I'd never heard of them that there wouldn't be much to them. And then realized that there was a lot to them, both in terms of the character and the makeup of the towns themselves, the architecture in the town, and also the history. So I did it. So it took 10 years.
Wow.
Some towns I did have to go back. Digital photography is wonderful until your digital files get corrupted and you got to go back. I did have a rule, is that I never read about a town before I went, which is sometimes why I had to go back. But I wanted to discover it with completely fresh eyes, without the bias of having read about it before. But so it was a 10-year process. I wish I could have stayed in most towns for 2-3 days to really soak them in and soak them up, and maybe wait for the best light for certain pictures. But believe it or not, one cannot feed a family of 5 people by writing these books. So I have a full-time job, and I could not take months and months to do this. But over 10 years, long weekends, and sometimes week-long jaunts, I would drive through the state and go from town to town.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Excellent. Let me check here. Okay, question here. What is your favorite story about a specific town from your travels or your research for the book? Anyone stand out for you? A favorite story?
Um, I I really I've already talked a little bit about a couple kind of quirky stories, but I think one of the more emblematic ones is Norway, Illinois. So a lot of towns were named after a place, whether that was connected to someone's family history or some place that kind of evoked important things to them. But Norway really was built by Norwegians with a specific purpose of being kind of a Norwegian promised land.
Wow.
The man who came over is kind of one of the fathers of Norwegian immigration. He came here to scope out good land, good places to be, and then went back and spread the word and came back with a boat full of Norwegians. And two things stand out from that entry. One, we all think about Prairie Home Companion and Minnesota being kind of the place for Norwegians, although there certainly are plenty of Norwegians left in Illinois. And Iowa has a lot of them too, so does Wisconsin. Most of those people, if they came in the 19th century, did not come through Chicago. They came through Norway, Illinois, which is kind of an amazing thing. When you go to Norway today, you still can grab a Norwegian dish at the restaurant in the gas station. There is Norwegian architecture, but to picture that thousands of people made the trek here through this little spot in Illinois to then populate the rest of the Midwest is really rather amazing. And it's kind of our own mini version of the gateway to the West. The other thing that's interesting that we can all laugh about now that it's late March, the Norwegians found it cold here, which I think says something. Some of the other towns that just between the story and the look and feel of the town, that two of which are really pretty close for folks who live in Sandwich, is Ottawa, which many people know because it's near Starved Rock, although people go to Starved Rock and don't stop in Ottawa, which is kind of criminal in my head. Obviously, people know about it from the Lincoln versus Douglas debate, but it literally has the most frescoes and most steeples that I've seen in any small town, and that includes, France and Italy. That is the kind of place where people should really discover. If you've not been to Geneva, Illinois, which also traces its name indirectly to Switzerland, that it's just a joy full of treasures. The town itself, someday we'll be able to really go to art galleries and restaurants with a freer mind. But you can rent a bike, you can drive down the river, see a Japanese garden, see some Frank Lloyd Wright architecture, see one of the more authentic Dutch wood mills that experts have said is just as grand, if not grander, than anything in Holland. And the state is just chock full of those stories. But for me, the most fascinating one of all is Cairo/Cairo. It's a microcosm, I think, of our state in many ways. It certainly is kind of a great look back into the history. If you go to Cairo today, it has grand old homes that will just make your heart melt. They are gorgeous. It's truly the southern tip of the state. You cross the bridge, and you're in Kentucky. But you're also just taken away by decay. We haven't taken great care of our past and of our history as a state. And we also, the social gaps are pretty evident there too. And we also haven't always taken great care of each other. But Kara is just a wonderful destination, as far south as you can get in the state. A fairly violent place with some lynching going on early in the 20th century. Very much southern in many ways, and yet in one of history's great ironies, became one of the northernmost staging areas for Grant's army during the Civil War. And just for me, a great encapsulation just how wonderful and complex and often unsuspected Illinois history can be.
Excellent. Some folks would like to hear you talk more about that shift from coal to corn, as you know it, and what the story is behind the shift from coal to corn.
Well, simply, the most simply stated, Illinois coal is dirty. So coal has got a bad name now, period, right? Because of evolving pollution standards. But the problem with Illinois coal is it was actually usually easier to get to than most places. Kind of easier to get to in Illinois than some places in West Virginia, for instance. But also dirtier because it was less pure. And so as it falls out of favor, a lot of towns starts losing some of their luster. But Sicily, Illinois, Sheffield, Illinois, Toluca, Illinois, Panama, Illinois, all coal towns where it was not agriculture. It was the town flourished because of coal. The railroad came because of coal, because the coal had to be moved. And in some instances, the coal left and the towns knew how to reinvent themselves. And in other instances, and the fact that the railroad already was there then allowed for the town to continue thriving because agriculture by then had flourished as well, and agricultural goods need to be moved. But the best example of this is Toluca, Illinois. A lot of the towns, because either of the size of the mine or in later years removed the slag piles, but you come to Toluca, Illinois, and there's twin mounds that look like mountains, and I don't have to tell you our state is a bit flat. So you see them from miles and miles around. And those are just the remnants of mining on which grass and trees have started growing. But that very much still marks the same kind of scene that you see in West Virginia, that you might see in Belgium, that you don't really see around here anymore. But that was our coal past that we usually forget about. Even some of the very small town like Cuba. Mm-hmm. Cuba started because of a coal vein, because there was a coal vein and it was shallow and it was easy to get to, and it was coal. It was not, I think, in our collective imagination, and there is a lot of that. But in our collective imagination, people came to cut the trees, build log cabins, and cultivate the fields, and there was a lot of that. But a lot of that was about coal, and a lot of that was about industry. The reason a lot of the towns are on rivers, obviously it's got drinking water and it's got water for irrigation. But there are two other reasons that at least were, that I was oblivious to, is that most of the people came via, the stuff we see in what's that movie with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman? They come with the horse-drawn cars and so forth. But a lot of people, especially in the southern half of the state, came via boat. And some of them came from the East Coast via boat. And you go to the large ports on the Mississippi, on the Ohio, And then you realize there's not many resources left for you to tap into. There's not many jobs. So you go to the next river up and you start finding other towns. And eventually those don't really hold any more potential for the new people. So they make their way further up. And that's why we have a lot of settlements on the rivers, because not only that's how people got here, but for decades, for many towns, that was the only way to get anything in and out of town. No roads, no railroads. And then the other reason is industry. We were a much more industry-driven state that we often think about. Marseilles, Illinois, another town not pronounced like its namesake, was named after the French port with the hope that it would one day rival it. But mills were, and you need water for mills, and you need water for other plants, and so a lot of times it was about industry as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. See, someone here mentioned Cherry, Illinois has a coal mine, and there was a mine disaster. And I know I have family down in Roanoke, Illinois, and my brother lives at the base of what they call Jumbo, which is the coal mine, and there's a flag on top of it, and it's a little hill that we think of as a mountain,
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone asked about seeing Libsyn in your book. What impressed you there in Libsyn?
I'm sorry, Libsyn.
Yeah. Lisbon. Sorry, Lisbon.
Lisbon. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes, Lisbon.
I'm having either the vaccine is kicking in or.
No, I said that incorrectly. So you're all good. You're all good.
Well, actually, funny enough, Lisbon is the first town I went to.
Fascinating.
That was the very first place I went. And I don't know why I picked it. It's certainly not the closest, but the name kind of was exotic. And I went to Lisbon, and actually Lisbon is a good example. It's very much agricultural today, but it has a fun history with the early schools. We forget too. I mentioned the railroad as a big moment. The arrival of industry, the school determined whether the town made it or not. Now we all know the school took a backseat to the needs of whatever work needed to happen in town. But Lisbon has some of the greatest barns and more unusual barns that I saw in the state. That's one of the few towns I could simply not dig up any connection as to exactly where the name came from. Most other places I was able to arrive at some, at least historical guess. And Lisbon, which is kind of fun, kind of remains a complete mystery as to why it got named that.
Fascinating.
But every town has a fun little story. So not many brick buildings in a lot of our towns, especially back in the early 19th century. And Lisbon was a steakhouse of sorts at the stagecoach stop. And President Martin Van Buren made his way because, yes, they did cross the country, and they sometimes couldn't do it by train. So, the President of the United States is having a steak dinner at the brick stagecoach building in Lisbon.
Wow, that's awesome. That's awesome. Another question for you. What was your criteria for an interesting town name? And then they say Sandwich is far from normal.
In every sense of the term, right? Because you're not
Yes.
that close to normal.
Yeah.
Well, the criteria was I had to. They're all towns of either places in antiquity or places that exist somewhere else in the world. And I did draw a line because otherwise I would still be in this for another 10 years. I drew a line. Maybe there's another book in here somewhere, maybe by me, maybe by someone else, at the names of people. So we do have Lincoln, we have Bismarck. There's a fair amount of towns in Illinois named after people. But I decided to stick with places because there's a more direct connection to countries and kind of physical places. Although places like Bismarck are named that because of the German immigrants, the same German immigrants who named some of the other German places in the state. I also drew the line at other American places. There is a place in Southern Illinois named America. And my regret is that I didn't include that one. I probably should have, but there's a lot of other places named after other places. There's a Philadelphia, Illinois that has a fascinating story that has been written about lately. There's Oregon, Illinois, which is featured in the book in passing, but is not featured as in its own right in the book. So that was the criteria. And I thought by just picking the names with the places with foreign names, it was kind of like dropping a pencil. You can't write about every town in the state. But I knew that by picking those names, it was like picking a pencil in a map. It was pretty random. And it gave me a really fascinating cross-section of the state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The original plat of Sandwich was by Almond Gage. One attendee writes here, where did beverage come in? So
Scott, I was going to say this earlier and I forgot. So I'm sure that there are researchers on this with deep roots in Sandwich who may be able to correct it. The mention of beverage, which is spelled R-I-D-G-E, is from a 19th century history of DeKalb County. Now, there is plat and plat, and I found this over time that some people, quote unquote, come up with the plat, and then some people buy the plot, and some people actually plat the town, and some people actually record the town. So I found that the first plat can be kind of a moving target in terms of what it is. It certainly is. At least the source I found was that the first plat was recorded by this person Beverage, which, by the way, doesn't validate it in any way. I think the official history of Sandwich itself picks up the story, so does that of DeKalb County. But that's one of the problems with oral history is you can get one kind of apocryphal story and everybody picks it up, and it turns out it's wrong. So I'd love to get more information tonight or offline about the first plat and the name you have for the first plat.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, and we'll share your website before we close out tonight, where people can reach out to you. And I see a question about how they can find your book, and so we'll definitely share that at the end of the session.
And I love to sell my book.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you have to remember, it's also several copies at the Sandwich Library. So
yes, that's correct. That's correct. And we're going to, for everyone who listed how many people they had with them tonight, we're going to do a drawing for a copy of your book. So someone will get to come in the library and take a copy of that home. Another question here, Cuba, Illinois, is it named after the island?
Indirectly, yes. And it's one of those things too that I did not mention is that the names are contagious. So sometimes a town gets named for another country or someone's idea, and sometimes a town gets named because people think the cool name is cool, and just up the road there's a name that inspires somebody. So there is we have Havana, as people say it in the book, and we have Cuba, and it's fairly light. And by the way, there was I probably missed a couple, but there was several Cubas in Illinois at one point.
Wow.
Now you have to remember too that a lot of times what's going on in the world, meaning people are reading about it in the paper, also influences people. So in the 19th century, there were a lot of stories about Cuba, and as you know, we eventually had a tangled history with Cuba long before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Teddy Roosevelt both tangled and tangoed in Cuba, I think. So there's a bit of it's a bit unclear if Cuba inspired Havana or if Havana inspired Cuba. The Havana itself was actually inspired by an island in the river that people thought might look like the island on the map. There is a sense that Cuba itself, while there's writings in the 19th century about the island off of Florida by the same name, that it was one instance where this was more contagion because there was Havana up the way, and a lot of places around Peoria have these foreign names. And I think there was a lot of inspiration there, including also what I call the Chinese Triangle, Canton, Pekin, and Shanghai City.
Mm-hmm.
So Cuba probably got its name. It's sometimes hard to decipher, in the rearview mirror of history, but it looks like Cuba probably actually got its name because Havana was there, but Havana got its name from the island of Cuba. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, with this Cuba, there were two Cubas literally next door to each other, and it was a fight to the death, and this Cuba prevailed. So the one that's left is the one that's obviously prevailed and is still around. But another example of a town that kind of has embraced its heritage. I don't know how many people have gone to a small town in Illinois where some of the buildings are painted aqua and peach and pink. And so that gives you kind of a Caribbean flair to this town that really tells you people in town are kind of having fun with the association that they have with that island in the Caribbean.
Excellent. One viewer wants to know if the story of the bear in the Sandwich jail ever came up in your research.
No, and I'd love to hear more. That sounds fun, and like it probably sounds like it would be juicy and probably should be in. That one I did not see it. Again, I wish I'd had more time to research every last town.
Yeah.
I'm sorry we're not all live, because I would ask you to just tell me that story.
Again, folks, feel free to contact him through his website and share that. I'll share briefly the oral tradition that was passed down to me is that at some point there was a bear that was locked in one of the cells in the jail, but it turned out that it was just a very large dog. And it was such a large dog that the people thought it was a bear, and they were trying to protect the town, and so they put the bear in jail, but it was actually just a large dog. So if all of you are listening and that's totally wrong, feel free to correct me, but it's a humorous story. And we have one person here who says they have a copy of that story. So feel free to reach out through the website and share that. I'm sure you'd be happy to hear that.
And one thing I certainly found through the research is that the settlers certainly never indulged in liquor. So never mistake a dog for a bear.
Exactly. Oh, absolutely. Let's see here, a couple other questions. I'd like to hear you share a little bit about your coming to America and why you chose to stay. And obviously you're very passionate about Illinois, and maybe kind of where that began for you.
Well, it's a little bit the story about Paris and realizing, there's probably more to this than I thought. The simple story is I was an exchange student. You don't choose where you go. They told me I was coming here. You couldn't Google it then. That was 30 some years ago. And so turns out it's near this place, Chicago. And this is before Michael Jordan put Chicago on the map. So I had no idea what that, I knew vaguely. I remember the Untouchables series, Al Capone. I mean, that's just whenever I told somebody you're going to Chicago, it was,
Yeah.
ta, 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 ta. But I think that, I've always had Wanderlust, which is how I ended up here from all that way. So I think that's what I hope the book will do for people. Give them a sense that there's actually exciting discoveries right around the corner from where they live, and that again we don't go to. I mean, people ask me where they should go. I said, well, don't miss Ottawa. Do go to Geneva. I've told them about Sandwich. I know we've got COVID, but eventually I hope people can catch a show at the Opera House. Most towns had an Opera House, but very few towns actually have shows at the Opera House anymore. And Sandwich does, and so that's fun.
Yeah. Another question: did you find that most of the towns embrace their unique name, like the Cuba colors you mentioned? Sandwich doesn't seem to live into that humor too well.
A lot of the towns don't, which doesn't mean they're not interesting and don't have their own interesting history. But a lot of the towns don't. And I think sometimes the histories have kind of gotten lost along the way, by the way. So I hope the book, helps with that. Obviously, Norway very much embraces it. I mean, there's Norwegian architecture and Norwegian food. Places like, several of the places with Scottish names had the same history as Norway. People came, we forget now, but there's not much to do in Scotland. Certainly not in the 18th century when the English are trying to kill you. And so, people pay good money. Entire towns pool their money together to fund explorers to come to the US, who then, same as with the story about the rivers earlier, they come to the East Coast and it's crowded and there's not much land and the cities are not that welcoming and everything's expensive. So they make their way west. And so in the northern part of the state, there are several settlements that came that way. A Scottish explorer came, essentially a bounty hunter for land, finds suitable land where it's cheap because they're usually given a budget, goes back to Scotland and says, here's what I found. And then you get thousands and thousands of Scottish people. So those places tend to have preserve a sense of that provenance. A lot of the places in the southern part of the state are having a lot of fun with the Little Egypt thing, even though there's nothing to do with Egypt. Certainly not the place. More probably the biblical place, and possibly the whole Napoleon in Egypt, which captured the imagination of the country. And there's actually that's the other boundary, no dead towns. But there was a town named Napoleon, not far from Metropolis. Metropolis embraces its name, so for different reasons. Obviously, par excellence, and by definition, Metropolis is a big city. It's the big city by definition, right? That's the actual definition of the name. But they obviously celebrate being, and by the way, huge in the history of the country in terms of the Spanish and the French and the Americans and it changing hands and the fort there. But obviously it's about Superman. But most people don't realize that actually the pitch was that Metropolis was going to be like Great America with a Metropolis theme. It was going to be DC Comics' answer to Disney World. That didn't really pan out, but you can't go anywhere in Metropolis without stumbling on, Lois Lane or Superman doing various things, including flying out of a building. In a similar vein, in Chester, in one of the more fascinating parts of the state, which is southern Illinois by the Mississippi, that's where the old capital Kaskaskia is. There's vintage. There's the vintage bell, which was given by the French king, but became the Liberty Bell of the West because the Americans freed the area from the English on the 4th of July. So in Chester, and there's the old Fort de Chartres, which was the French capital fort, which you can visit, which is a wonderful place to be, especially when there's no COVID, and you can go there for their rendezvous days where everyone is in period garb. And that's not a very far drive from Sandwich. Chester is the hometown of Popeye because Seeger, the author of Popeye, was from there. And so there's a Popeye museum, and Popeye and all the other characters are all around town. Pekin has certainly, in good and bad, embraced the Chinese name. And the Chinese name has nothing to do with China. I mean, it has everything to do with China because it's named for China, but it's not Chinese people who gave it the name. Mm-hmm. It was Westerners who came and settled. And there was a theory both in Pekin and in Canton that if you dug straight through, you'd land in China. Mm-hmm. Not the case, actually, but that's what got the name. And so Pekin decided to really celebrate it. There's still a fair amount of Chinese restaurants, but they named their town by a slur I'm not going to use. At least their mascot for their school and their teams were named after a slur for Chinese people. But at the same time, they were way ahead of where we are today as a country. Whatever you think of some of the travails we've had, because in the 1970s there was Everett Dirksen was the U.S. senator who helped pass the Civil Rights Act, was from Pekin, and so civil rights was actually very much on the mind of the town, and they were very forward thinking. It still took years of controversy, but they actually changed their name. And today we're still having controversies about some team names, both professional and not professional teams. But in Pekin, they were ahead of the curve. Paris certainly celebrates its heritage. Kind of only really goofy stories as to why it became Paris, but the most likely is that's not goofy. People came from Kentucky, and there's a Paris there, but you can't hardly go anywhere in Paris and not see the Eiffel Tower. At the diner, at their haircut place, Glencoe, Illinois, celebrates its heritage, even though when you dig at the story, actually it was the guy who named it was more English than Scottish. But they grabbed the town, they grabbed the seal of the town in Scotland, and they just completely ran with it. So it really runs the full gamut in terms of towns that embrace their heritage. I'll finish with because it's actually not any kind of make-believe or just keeping history alive, is Carthage, which obviously was named after the great mythical city in antiquity, but is where, speaking of jails, this is where the great Mormon prophet was murdered by a mob. And that's what eventually precipitated the departure of the Mormons to Utah. But you cannot go to Carthage today and not see when I was there, more Utah car plates than Illinois car plates. Loads and loads and loads of buses, because it is one of the holiest places for Mormon people. And so that place not only has kept a link, but really honors. And in fact, the Great Temple, which is just an amazing sight on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi, was burned, probably by anti-Mormon people in the 1840s. And the Mormon Church, because it is such a holy place for them, actually rebuilt it to spec, using it's different inside. Unfortunately, it's modern inside, but from the outside, they rebuilt it exactly to the blueprints from the 19th century. So that. There's a lot of places up and down Illinois that really, really cherish their connection to the past.
Wow, that's amazing. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing these stories, and I definitely think you've thrown a spotlight on communities that otherwise we wouldn't know about and maybe wouldn't be interested in visiting. So thank you for sharing about your book with us. I want to show folks how they can find you online, and so I'm just going to share my screen here, and this is Laurent's website. You can find him at laurentpernotbooks.com. And here right at the front, you'll find information about this book we've been talking about. He did want us to know that it's available in hard copy, but also as an ebook on Amazon. Is that right?
Yeah, Amazon and Google Books. One thing I learned, my first book was published by the U of I Press. This one is self-published. That's a whole different conversation. But I found that Amazon is not that kind to authors. So if you want to be kind for authors for the same price, buy the book on Google Books if you can. That's
okay.
Great
to know.
My quick plug.
Yeah, that's excellent. And then you can also see here 3 of his other books that may really interest folks here. He mentioned this book about the history of the Cubs, but also Ferdinand. And I wanted to ask, is this book, this French family in the war, is this any connection to your family?
Yeah, that's a novella, but that's my great uncle. That's my grandmother's brother, who was killed in a tank in the early German attack in World War II. But it's really about my family picking up the pieces during the war and some of the choices we all make to survive. And I try to not be judgmental, but there were plenty of the choices, I think, for good and bad. But it is linked to my family. Yeah. Absolutely.
Oh, that's wonderful. And then folks can also find a way to contact you here. And so if someone wants to send the full bear story, feel free to do that. You can find that on his website. So that's how you can find Laurent online. And let's give away a copy of his book. And so I've gotten everyone's names written down here that has participated. And the winner is Audie. Audie is the winner of the copy of this book. So you can come into the library and pick up that copy. And so congratulations.
Way to go, Audie. Have a good time and happy trails.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Let me share a couple events that we have coming up just around the corner. We have tomorrow, actually. Let me share my screen here so you can see. Tomorrow at noon, we'll be hosting a community forum with our mayoral candidates, and all 3 candidates will be with us here on Zoom. You can find the information on our website, of course, and how to join that session, but they will be responding to your questions. You can also find a place to submit your questions in advance before tomorrow at noon if you would like to do that. And then besides that, we've got one other event to share with you, and that was a week from tonight. We will be hosting Dr. Julie Iorama from the University of Chicago, and she's going to be doing a creative writing roundtable with us. And so that will be a Zoom meeting, actually. So when you come, you will be seen and heard if you would like to be. And she's going to share a little bit of her writing, and then we're going to, just like tonight, engage in Q&A about creative writing. And so we'd invite you next Tuesday night at the same time, 6:30, to join us here online again for that event. So Laurent, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your time with us this evening. It was truly a joy to get to hear you talk about our community as well as so many others.
Thank you so much. It was fun being in Sandwich in My Mind again.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll see you real soon. Happy reading. Bye-bye.
Thanks.